Okay, well, it's 3 minutes past, so I think we shall get started. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I did warn you last month that the autumnal feels were upon us, so I've already got my heating on maximum. It's getting dark early, and I'm even thinking about dragging the box of Halloween decorations out of the garage. It's about that time, so we like to go big in our house. I think our neighbours are already dreading October. So, thank you all for coming. The team at the Society continue to work hard. We've been out and about discussing options for many things, including the epic storage issues the county is facing currently, as many of you will know about. And we've also been busy readying ourselves for several exciting conferences that are coming up over the next couple of months. Please check out the events section of the website for further details on what's on and how to attend. I'm almost finished the latest newsletter for the Society. So for our members, that should be with you in the next couple of weeks. I hope there's a good read. It's got all the latest news from us here and from the wider Kent heritage sector. If you missed any of our earlier talks, then of course you can venture back in time and watch all the incredible lectures we've had so far, all accessible on our YouTube channel and the website. So please do go and check them out. As always, we hope to avoid any technical issues, but please bear with us if there are any problems. Jacob's on hand, and as always, he'll be there to sort anything out if it goes wrong. If you're not a member, please do think about joining us. It works out about £3.30 a month, less than Bram Stoker's Dracula on DVD from eBay. I found that today. And for that, you'll receive a copy of our yearly journal, Archaeologia Cantiana, full of the most current historical and archaeological research in the county. You'll also receive our biannual magazine, regular newsletters, exclusive access to our collections, conferences, and selected events, opportunities to get involved in excavations and research projects, and you'll let us keep putting on brilliant content such as these free online talks, doing outreach in schools, community groups, and seminars, all the things that we hope brings the benefit of Kent history and heritage to everyone. So check the website for details on how to become a member. Right, housekeeping. The talk tonight will last for about an hour, after which we'll have time for questions if you have any. Please, can I ask you all to keep yourselves on mute with your cameras off throughout so that we can hear our speaker clearly. During the Q&A, you can either use the raise hand feature and we'll unmute you when it's your turn to ask the question, or if you prefer, you can type your question in the chat box and we'll read it out for you. I hope it goes without saying, but please be courteous and polite to our speaker and to each other. We will be recording the session and it may be posted to our video channels in the future, but no personal data will be shared. And if you ask a question, but we'll prefer it not to be published, just send us an email and we will make sure it's not included. Right, so foreign bits out of the way, on to our speaker. Dr. Dan Hicks is a professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford, curator of world archaeology at the Pitt-Rivers Museum, and a fellow of St. Cross College. Dan is also a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, with an embarrassment of academic achievements from some of the most respected universities across the globe. He's worked for over a decade. He worked as a professional field archaeologist and conducted fieldwork in the UK, in the Eastern Caribbean, and the Eastern United States. Dan has held various prestigious appointments in a triumphant and intensive career, and incredibly impressively, has received significant research funding, totaling over £7 million towards many important projects. His work focuses on the impacts of colonialism and uses archaeology to explore modern and contemporary history. Dan is also an accomplished author and editor, having published 9 books, including The Brutish Museums, The Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, which received critical acclaim and won several awards. He's delivered numerous prestigious lectures and has written for a variety of publications. You know how prolific an archaeologist or curator must be when they have their own incredible website, and this one is needed to fit in all his amazing achievements, which you can check out at www.danhicks.uk. So I usually consider myself to be completely maxed out and tell everybody that there's just no time to fit anything else in at all. But then I read the list of achievements that Dan has managed and realized that actually I'm very lazy, like sloth level lazy. He's had a phenomenal career, and Dan continues to challenge our thinking, our preconceptions of who heritage should belong to, and to ask important questions of our industry. He's here tonight to discuss aspects of his latest book, Every Monument Will Fall. The book, and I quote, offers an urgent reappraisal of how we think about culture and how to find hope, remembrance, and reconciliation in fragments of an unfinished, violent past. It is our absolute delight and utter pleasure to welcome Dan to talk to us tonight. So, Dan, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. That was a really nice introduction, Craig. Thanks a lot. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it will all work. So if you can see the PowerPoint, hopefully that will be working well. So that all looks all right. Thumbs up if it looks all right.
Not
That's
yet, it's still your
not yet.
screen.
It's still not okay. How's
There we go. That's the
we
one.
there? Yep.
Brilliant. Good to go.
Super. Okay, that's great. So thanks so much. I'm going to try to finish in under an hour, so we have a bit of time for a conversation afterwards. It's absolutely wonderful to be here, hosted by Kent Archaeological Society, and I'm not going to summarise the book I just published, which is the context of sort of what I'm sort of talking about at the moment. Instead, because there's so much in the book, and a lot of it is about, Pitt-Rivers as a character, as a founder, of our discipline, and of a figure that we're, sort of, thinking about in a whole host of different ways. I thought it was useful, really, to revisit some work we did sort of 10 years ago. And actually, I mean, we were hosted, and my sort of colleagues and I were hosted at sort of Kent probably 12 or 13 years ago, I guess, when we were doing a sort of project called Excavating Pitt-Rivers, when we were simply, doing the primary work of understanding sort of what is in the museum from him, and sort of, that he, dug up all his archaeological work, how that interrelates sort of with his, his sort of role in anthropology. So it's an update on that, really. It's going to be a bit of a tour of the county as we, go along. But hopefully I'm able to, as we go along and we talk about all of the different things he found and, the things that he, did in Kent, which involve, as you will see from the title, it involves not only excavation and field walking and archaeology, but also there's a lot about the history of militarism and the history of his role as a soldier. That's a part of that, and hopefully that's then a jumping off point for understanding the sort of, or for talking about those sort of wider issues that we're all interested in the present over, what do we make of a legacy of someone like Augustus Pitt-Rivers? And so here's the man himself, as he liked to be seen sort of later in life, after he had inherited a vast sort of fortune, with which he inherited a name. So really, we shouldn't be, talking about the, Pitt-Rivers Museum if we were strictly saying who sort of made the founding collection. It would not be Pitt-Rivers. It would be Augustus Henry Lane Fox, because that was his name until 1880, when he inherited a vast fortune that was made, as you can imagine, as ever with vast fortunes in the 19th century, made, as the book sort of goes into, from a whole host of different routes of largely Caribbean enslavement that comes along sort of various routes in Yorkshire, in North Wales, and elsewhere. He's a Yorkshireman by birth, although a Londoner in terms of how he grew up. And he spends a lot of time on the south coast and in Kent in his early years. And actually, Kent is a very important space for how he begins to link the militarism that's important for his sort of professional life as a soldier with his archaeology and anthropology. And actually, one of the big arguments that I've sort of put, or the things I've found out really about Fox, as actually we might sort of call him, Fox rather than Pitt-Rivers. Fox is really a character who, sort of uses the military thinking that that he's involved in order to shape how archaeology as a discipline sort of develops. And so we know him well as obviously, one of the inventors, arguably the main inventor of sort of modern sort of scientific excavation. Here's an example from the Pitt-Rivers of sort of one of his so-called medalettes that he left at the bottom of the trenches of the holes that he dug, stamped with a date stamp. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a gap there for him hammering in a date from the 1880s or the 1890s or earlier. And on the left-hand side, there's his sort of logo, if you like, designed by John Evans, the numismatist, and his sort of logo involves, as you can see, a mixture of archaeological sort of survey equipment and an archaeological pick with a dagger underground there and a skull and a collared urn, a Bronze Age urn, and also a bronze axe in the middle. So it's an interesting mix of elements which he uses really to sum up his thinking. We think of him as the excavator. Look close on the left-hand side, and you can see Pitt-Rivers sitting in a deck chair, watching excavation being undertaken at South Lodge in Wiltshire, on the Wiltshire-Dorset border. Or on the right-hand side, you can see him in the background. There's a horse behind him, and there is the character, there is the imposing figure of the man that's often known as the general at that point, who's overseeing the excavations with a sort of practiced militarism. Here is the fox or the Pitt-Rivers that we don't so often see. The carte de visite on the left-hand side. Here he is as a young soldier in Canada in the early part of the 1860s. And one thing I do in the book is I tell the story of his various military postings and where he served. And actually the Trent affair in the 1860s was amazingly important for him and indeed for world politics after the death of Albert and the risk. Last time there was a risk in sort of politics around the world that there might be a war between the Americans and sort of Canada. There was a massive sort of movement of sort of troops out there, and he was part of that. We don't know much about his earlier images. There is a potential, and I make this argument in the book. There's actually this image. It's a famous image by the photographer and sort of comrade of Augustus Pitt-Rivers in the Grenadier Guards, Roger Fenton. That this image from the British Museum from 1857 actually shows Pitt-Rivers in the middle. If you look at the two men, obviously at that sort of point in history, it's a bit like the 1970s. There was a lot of longer hair and sort of facial hair as well, and everyone looked a little bit the same. But I like to think that maybe here's an early image of Augustus Pitt-Rivers there at the British Museum. So who is this man? How do we make sense of him? And sort of what are the links to the museum that bears his name, or as I put it in the book, his necronym, the sort of death name that he inherits with all of this money, because it isn't really his name. Here is the Pitt-Rivers. It's an institution in which I've now worked for over 18 years as curator of world archaeology. Founded in 1884 with sort of 30,000 objects or so, it now has 300,000 or so objects, about 300,000 photographs, a range of other archival materials and film archives and so forth. And really, it is a product, though it's an institution which is sort of set up in some ways as an intellectual legacy for his theories, because Augustus Pitt-Rivers was important for a range of different reasons. If you read the textbooks, he's sort of celebrated as a founder as I've mentioned, of sort of the modern discipline of archaeology, especially field work, but also intellectually, the links with anthropology. He was a, a central individual in the founding or the merging of ethnological and anthropological thinking in the 1860s. He invented a model of the sort, what in America they would call the four-field model of anthropology, in which archaeology is sort of a part of anthropology in those ways. He was absolutely the key individual in the founding of anthropology and archaeology within the University of Oxford, and thereby within our universities internationally. He was the first inspector of ancient monuments in the UK, and therefore has this enormously important role in the history of sort of preservation and also the definition of what sort of counts as a monument. He was important also in the founding of museums and the idea that museums might have an educational sort of function. And this is where the typological arguments, which is a sort of cultural evolutionism, if you like, sort of came in. And so here is the diagram that he showed in the middle of the 1870s, at the time at which, for the first time, he had his objects on display to the public in East London, in sort of Bethnal Green. If any of you know the Young V&A, as it's now called, it was the Museum of Childhood until recently. That building held his first exhibition from 1874 till 1878. He then had objects at South Kensington and what's now the V&A until 1882 to 3, when he handed over all those objects over to the Pitt-Rivers, and the Pitt-Rivers was built in Oxford as a legacy collection. All the way through, there is this idea of what the collections are doing, which is summed up really in this sort of diagram. So it's a diagram in which every one of these objects, which are from Aboriginal Australia, but were not sort of based on him himself sort of paying a visit or doing sort of field work in Australia, he sort of buys these objects as they wash up from Empire at the auction houses and the dealerships of London. He arranges these objects, which are all weapons, as well as all from a single Aboriginal sort of culture. He arranges them according to what he calls series. These are hypothetical evolutionary series of objects. One object that's in the diagram is not a real object. In the middle, there's an imaginary wooden stick. And as you see, that idea of almost that idea that, the first weapon was a stick. Think about sort of 2001, A Space Odyssey, with that opening sequence of the bone that gets thrown up into the air and it turns into a spaceship. And in some ways, I mean, this is the diagram which is sort of arguing that point and making that point in a very 19th century way, in that with each iteration, each sort of moment of use, that object evolves or changes. So you get the boomerangs moving out to the left-hand side, you've got the lances at the bottom, you've got the shields, because importantly for Pitt-Rivers, sort of shields were also a form of weapon, and you've got the clubs at the top. So in some ways, what you have in front of you is a fairly conventional sort of, Victorian improvement narrative, that things are always getting better and improvement. And the Great Exhibition was a great sort of moment in, obviously, sort of several years earlier, in order to celebrate how, technology is always improving. But there are really sort of other aspects that are going on here as well. On the one side, of course, they're all weapons. And what Augustus Pitt-Rivers is doing is he's starting to build a theory of material culture that is not only about weapons, it's about all material culture, that is, however, based on that idea that weapons are improving all the time. So it's a militaristic kind of model for how we think about how objects sort of change over time. And the context was for that, because of his sort of military background, was all the evolution of how weapons were changing at the time, which of course in the 1870s was all about the moment at which machine guns were about to be used in Africa and elsewhere, by the British, and that you have this enormous sort of difference in between those who are trying to defend themselves with sort of bows and arrows, uh, and sort of those who have, rocket launchers and, machine guns and steam power and so on. So this is, as I argue in the book, a lot of his sort of thinking here is about the relationships in between objects and militarism, but also about these histories of empire and how a sense of the past and present might be used to do that. So how can archaeology help us understand these things? Fundamentally, the educational side of what he sought to do in East London was to tell people, and to tell, especially because it was East London, to tell the ethnically diverse and working class communities of London that change isn't going to happen fast. The revolution is a very, very bad idea. It won't work. He's a veteran of 1848, of course. He's 21 years old when you're in the key year of the publication of the Communist Manifesto and all of the unrest across Europe. And that's a very, very important sort of context for his thinking. So that's the background. That's the intellectual background. What does that mean that Pitt-Rivers was up to in Kent? How can the county of Kent, and of course he interacted with the society, where the Kent Archaeological Society is old enough to have had a relationship with Pitt-Rivers, so we're all in some ways sort of thinking about what are the histories of our organizations, and that's both the important and ongoing important role of sort of local societies for what archaeology is in our country today, and sort of how we receive the thinking of the people like Pitt-Rivers. So I'm just going to run over now in this map of Kent. I haven't got a map, I'm afraid, but hopefully you know the county well enough, or while I'm talking you can have your maps app open and you can look up exactly where we're talking about. And we can talk about how important the county was for his career and his thinking. So we can start at Chatham. And we can start with the 21-year-old Augustus Pitt-Rivers appearing in print in the Illustrated London News in the summer of 1848, in the context of uprisings across Europe. There is Lieutenant Fox mentioned as one of the Grenadier Guards who is part of an East India Company mock siege of London in front of the court of directors of the East India Company. There's this enormous performance of what happens if London was under threat. It's an imaginary attack upon a fake redoubt. And there is Fox at the front, Augustus Pitt-Rivers, as he would be later on, at St Mary's Barracks in Chatham. That idea that this is about the defense of the nation, the defense of the capital, links in with his ideas in terms of prehistory. And later in 1868, here's our first object from the Pitt-Rivers, an object when returning to Chatham, he picks up an undated flint scraper from Chatham. His involvement with Kent really gets important when he moves there. He moves to Hythe in order to take up the role as a 26-year-old in 1853 as the first instructor of musketry at the newly established Hythe School. And so Fox and his wife Alice lived there until March 1854. And then he was sort of transferred to Malta. This was in the run-up to the Crimean War. And there's a great deal about Augustus Pitt-Rivers' role in the Crimean War, how he saw action at the Battle of Alma, and the effect upon him of seeing the transformation of living landscapes through industrialized warfare into essentially, horrorscapes of archaeological sort of proportions, where all of a sudden there were trenches being dug for sort of burying the dead. There was the looting of the dead bodies for objects. All of these, sub-archaeological elements were there in the experience of warfare. And in many ways, the relationship of archaeology with war and the militarism of the way in which we dig trenches, the way in which we, use our bodies when we excavate, has a relationship there. But at this point, his sort of training of bodies is not about excavation, but about musketry. He develops a theory of musketry, which is about the improvement of the rifle on exactly the model that we saw that later diagram about how weapons improve, which is linked into the training of the body in order to make the soldier sort of fit the weapon in certain ways. And so, like Woolwich had been a centre for the training in artillery, Hythe was going to be important for infantry firepower. So they moved into the Napoleonic era sort of buildings at Hythe, near the Sainsbury's, if you know Hythe well, and they sort of practiced on the dunes, and the butts were set up on the dunes. They purchased a whole sort of range of the beach land, in order to do the training. And they received many. This was the beginning of the volunteer sort of service, sort of later on, and that was how, in many ways, these sorts of training regimes only got more intense, under a man called Hay a bit later on. But it's really Fox that's there at the beginning. And importantly, in the years running up to 1853, he had undertaken a tour of Europe. He'd gone to the Piedmont, he'd gone to Paris, he'd been to Belgium, and to many of the places where the new sort of cutting edge weapons technology of the rifle were being developed, because he had been sort of tasked with the role as a young officer of sort of testing and experimenting with and adopting the rifle as the service weapon of the British Army. And so in order to replace the musket, or the Brown Bess, as it was known, with a rifle that worked on the Minier system, a different sort of bullet, a different sort of rifling of the inside of the barrel that, of course, improved the shot. This is at the heart of his sort of theory of how material culture changes. So after the Crimean War, he comes to the conclusion that a relatively small difference in sort of technological change, the fact there's rifling on the inside of a gun, is something, because there were more rifles on the Ottoman and the French and the English, or the British sides, as compared with the Russian Empire, that a change of that, that a difference of that kind in terms of objects is something that makes empires fall or succeed. That actually these sort of changes, these evolutions, not of the human species, this isn't a kind of sort of racial supremacy, although there are certainly elements of sort of the fake racial sciences that sort of persist in his thinking in very interesting ways and very sort of troubling ways. But even more troubling, maybe, is this idea of cultural supremacism, of sort of material cultural or technological supremacism. And I talk about that a lot in the book, but it's really grounded in his work with improving the rifle. We could get into the back and forth, which I won't here now, about his arguments with sort of General Hay and the story about how the rifle is adopted and how the system of musketry is sort of set up. But he tells the story in different ways in the 1870s. The key thing is that there is this work he does in order to develop and experiment with, in sort of Woolwich and elsewhere, with what sort of became an Enfield rifle, as we see here from the Pitt-Rivers collections, but also the experience of the looting of these objects from the Alma and the bringing back of rifles, helmets, insignia, religious items from the bodies of the dead Russians that came into the Pitt-Rivers collection. So many of these museums at this time, sort of before they turn into anthropology museums, are museums of arms and armor. They're museums of weaponry. They have this intimate relationship with militarism. So what he's doing at Hythe is he's really developing a science. They're teaching classes on theory of how to work out how to point your rifle. And when you look at the instruction of musketry book, when you look at the accounts of the way in which they were adopting, this sort of rifle or that, and they were thinking about the process. They were developing the registers that recorded firing practice and who got what near the bullseye. They are making tables that record exactly what shot certain people record. These are almost the beginning of the sort of recording that we ourselves use in archaeology in terms of context sheets or recording things on site. There's an amazing relationship here in between the sorts of tabular forms here, the measurement of distance, the surveying, how far away is the target, the drawing of sections and the drawing of sort of plans, and even the recording of what the atmosphere and the weather was like, which certainly, I mean, when I first learned how to fill in a context sheet, I was always told to say, what was the weather like in exactly the same as is being written down. So there's a sort of prehistory, a sort of proto-history here of archaeological recording that is there in how he's encouraging these sorts of troops, to be sort of recording their shots. So that's Hythe. So Hythe's very important in terms of his thinking, but there's no archaeology involved yet. One relationship with archaeology that becomes very important is Augustus Pitt-Rivers' friendship, and later indeed relationship in the family with Lubbock, John Lubbock, who was brought up at Elms Estate near Down, which is a bit of a cheat because it's no longer in Kent. It's now over the border into Bromley. But a bit later on, I think I allow myself sort of Lubbock if we're talking about Kent, because he did later on, after Pitt-Rivers died, he bought sort of a big castle site up at sort of Broadstairs, at Kingsgate. He trained also with the Kent Army artillery militia from the 1850s, and almost certainly, Lubbock and Pitt-Rivers know each other from Kent in those days. Later on, Lubbock married Augustus Pitt-Rivers' daughter. So even though they were the same sort of age, he became his son-in-law. And these relationships, these sort of personal relationships in the growing antiquarian sort of scene in London and Kent were enormously important. I've got one little footnote which I wanted to mention for Craig, which is simply that later on another link of a similar or later generation was that a man called sort of Frederick James was the curator at the Maidstone Museum from 1891, another one of sort of Pitt-Rivers' team, who he trained up in excavation in the same way as many years earlier he'd been training people in rifle shooting. So that's the militaristic background, if you like, and some of the sort of social sort of dimensions of Kent. What about the archaeology that he did in Kent and what he thought he was doing? Well, we can start, you can see we've sort of reached where we're going to get into Folkstone with sort of, what is really his sort of larger excavation. And then I'm going to tell you about a series of other objects which are now in Oxford in the Pitt-Rivers collection, which are from Kent. So we're going to keep on moving around the county, and we're now off to Folkstone. Actually, we're not off to Folkstone, sorry. We're off to Broadstairs first and then to Folkstone. So we're going to go to Thanet, in fact, for two archaeological sites there. So we start off in 1868, where he's back in Kent and he's in Thanet. And he describes in the year after his sort of lectures on, primitive warfare, which is really where he's beginning to build a series of links in between how archaeology might be able to help you with a history of sort of technological change and civilization, really based upon the idea that the history of the invasions that have happened in the United Kingdom are the same histories that later happened in terms of the invasion of the Americas and were happening at the same time that he was living in terms of the invasions and what he called the exterminations that were going on in Africa and Australia. So he wants to tell a story of indigenous people in Ireland, in England, who sort of died out in a similar way because of supposedly, culturally superior invaders. Sort of back in prehistory, into the Roman period, certainly in the Iron Age, and that's also something that happened, in the 16th century in the Americas and was happening in his present day in the 19th century. So it's real deep, Victorian imperialism using archaeology or wanting to find a way of using archaeology for telling that story. And he grounds it, for example, in some field walking that he does near Broadstairs. So he talks about a tract of land which extends about a mile north of Margate up to Broadstairs and Ramsgate. And in that location, he identifies a series of different flints, which are here are drawn one after another. Here they are in the Pitt-Rivers. So here are the actual objects that he sort of talked about, these worked flints that he found at the time as he was walking along those sort of coastlines. And his attempt here was to talk about the idea that these were evidence of what he thought of in terms of the work he was doing in sort of Sussex as evidence for sort of Neolithic arsenals. When he dug a site called Sisbury, which is the drawing we see in front of us here, he described this site for Neolithic manufacture of flint tools as a Neolithic armory, as a Woolwich of the Stone Age. And he's kind of trying and experimenting with sort of Broadstairs. He's interested in these coastal areas. He's very much interested in the defence of Britain. He's also doing the survey of hill forts along the Sussex coast at a time at which there's a lot of investment in terms of military sort of defence at that point because they're worried about the French. But he's sort of talking about this idea. Well, actually, have I found another one of these Neolithic armories in sort of Broadstairs? He isn't sort of later on. He sort of pulls back from that, and he decides maybe that isn't what he had found. But he does the same, or he thinks about the same interpretation when he's at another site, which were the brick earth excavations. He observes an early example of rescue archaeology, maybe one of the first examples in Kent of something that we would recognize as rescue archaeology, where some workmen are excavating a large hole for the brick earth in between Reading Street and St. Peter's, as he puts it, and they find worked flint alongside a series of other objects. And he thinks at the time that this is about the taking out of flint and the manufacture of weapons, and then the deposition of animal bones in order to have a burial sort of feast. All his interpretations are about violence and death. Basically, this is where he is at this point in terms of how he's interpreting things. Later on, he goes back and re-excavates or excavates the rest of the pit in 1870. And there's a long interpretation there of these pits. He refers to them as funereal in context and is slightly unclear as to whether they're, later prehistoric or Romano-British. In 1881, someone called Flaxman Spowell says that sort of Pitt-Rivers was inaccurate. It was simply a marl pit. But in 1969, Anne Ross, in her Gazetteer of Purposeful Deposition in the Iron Age, included the pit in her list of structured deposition sort of sites as we got to know them later on. So there's an interesting history of the changing interpretations of that site. Certainly, certainly for Pitt-Rivers, he was hoping to find evidence there of warfare. He talks, as I talk about in the book, he comes back from the Crimean War and is interpreting, the British landscape as evidence of one enormous war that had happened in the past in between indigenous people and invaders of different kinds. And that was the sort of archaeology he wanted to do. That was expanded more at Folkstone, where, for those of you that know Folkstone, as you come in, that enormous hill, sort of Castle Hill, known locally as sort of Caesar's Camp, was a site that he did his first really sort of large open area excavations. He was sort of fresh at that time from the Sussex Hill Forts survey, where he looked at all the hill forts that were on the south coast, sort of down there. And this large excavation of what sort of turned out to be, as we now know, or as he found out, a Norman ringwork, a medieval castle, not an Iron Age hill fort. He essentially accidentally undertook the first sort of major excavation or open area excavation of a medieval castle, or indeed a medieval site of any kind. So this was in the June to July of 1878. Large-scale excavation funded by the BAA and the Society of Antiquaries. He sort of took the place name really seriously. He does this sort of quite a lot, actually. He goes and digs up sort of Danes Dyke, kind of thinking it must be something to do with sort of Denmark when he's up in Yorkshire excavating that site. And he does the same here. Oh, it must be something to do with Caesar because that's there in the vernacular and in the place name. But he accidentally, as I say, ends up as the pioneer of sort of medieval archaeology. The comparison he's making is with Mount Caburn. Here is a sketch drawing he did in the pub in Lewes, in the Star Inn in Lewes in 1877 of his excavations at Mount Caburn. And what he wanted to do, as he says at Caesar's Camp, was to see to what extent we are justified, if at all, in forming an opinion upon the date of an entrenchment by its external appearance. He undertakes the excavation in sort of two parts. In the early summer of 1878, a team of sappers from the nearby Shorncliffe barracks were part of it. So he's even actually using military trained engineers for the excavation early on at the beginning of the project, opening the site up. And then he's employing 8 to 10 men per day in terms of local excavators. Flinders Petrie was in Kent undertaking his early survey of archaeological monuments. And there's a rivalry in between the two men, it seems. And he goes and sends a drawing or a survey of it, off to Pitt-Rivers on a day that Pitt-Rivers wasn't on site. But here is Pitt-Rivers' drawing of that site. Here are the excavations and the profiles of the trenches, the sections of the trenches that he dug. Absolutely crucially for this moment in archaeology, and this is something for Kent archaeology, I think, despite all of the slightly, dodgy or sort of wishful thinking interpretation that he undertook at the time, this is a really important moment for the history of archaeology in Kent, because really it's the beginning of the first model of scientific excavation. We kind of think of the work he did later on his own estate on the Wiltshire-Dorset border, but not only are you getting the plans and the sections, you're also getting for the first time what he calls the relic tables. So the presentation of objects, one after another, these incredibly detailed drawings in which the camera is being used in order to illustrate in these ways in his excavation reports. all of the items that he finds. You see in the top left-hand side the bone flute, which is found, which we're able to identify because these sort of drawings are so accurate in the collections of the Pitt-Rivers. Again, these other fragments of carved stone, which are there in those images, in those relic tables, as he puts it, are there, you know, sort of in the collection. So we can match those up. We can even match up an item that isn't in the Pitt-Rivers. It was sold on later on, but one of the most interesting objects in some ways from those excavations, the coin with the head of Matilda that was found. On the left-hand side here are images from his relic table. On the right-hand side here is what's on the Fitzwilliam Museum sort of website in their, in their inventory there. And actually, after 150 years, Pitt-Rivers sort of drawings actually rather better than the information you can get on the internet about this coin. He also labeled objects. So these are some of the labels that we receive. And actually, that idea of writing on objects, writing labels and attaching them onto objects is an incredibly interesting thing intellectually, that we turn an object into a document, into an archive of some sort, but also just for the history of handwritten labels, of finds tags written. Here we have. He was even sort of reusing greetings cards. So I don't know who sort of Colonel Martin was, I confess, but what I do know is that sort of Colonel Martin's name gets a line through it, and on the reverse of that card is a note that this is where we found the pottery. So some of the social history here, links in really nicely in terms of understanding the history. So that's his big excavation, really, is Caesar's camp, where he's again sort of going in, wanting to tell a story about invasion and indigenous resistance. And he ends up excavating a the evidence doesn't sort of match up to his theories. We can run through fairly quickly, just in the next 5 minutes or so, the rest of the sites. And then we come to the one that I guess, when I revisited this material in order to talk to you, I realized that my interpretation of last time I looked at an object sort of 15 years ago or so has really changed because of writing the book recently. But let's look at some of these other objects. From East Weir Bay, we've got an Iron Age coin that he picks up in 1878, or someone picks up for him and he purchases. And from Richborough, obviously wonderful sort of Roman site. If any of you haven't, I'm sure lots of you. I'm sure you often do field trips there and so on. Here is an item. I don't know. Is it a fake? Is it again a bit of wishful thinking? William Talbot Ready, a conservator, and to some degree, more than a conservator, from the British Museum at that time, recreates, if we can use that word, this bowl, a Samian ware bowl for Pitt-Rivers from Richborough, but a very piece of sort of Samian ware. Which is there. You can just see on the bottom, on the base, you can see repaired by William Talbot Ready. He was doing slightly more than simply repair. We've got, as we move on, so that was East Weir Bay and Richborough. We can move on to Reculver. I hope I'm saying that right, where there are 4 examples of the Paleolithic hand axes that people were picking up in the 1860s, 1870s. On that bit of the Kent coast in between Herne Bay and Reculver, from the gravels that cap the clays, on that bit of coastline. So there are 4 examples of the palette. Again, he is reading these as weapons. He is reading these as the weapons of what he's seeing, using his language of the primitive inhabitants, or the barbarous inhabitants. He was using all these terms, which he's also applying to contemporary kind of populations. Fundamentally, his sort of theory of archaeology was about survival, who survives and who doesn't, but the idea that he was living in a world in which there were survivals from the prehistoric present, actually or the prehistoric past in the present. He's got sort of two examples from the famous shipwreck, a Roman, Romano-British shipwreck with a whole load of Samian ware that here and there with the dredging and with other things, it washes up. In Kent from the Pudding Pan Rock shipwreck, and so Pitt-Rivers acquires in the 1870s two of these of examples from this site, from this underwater site off the coast of Kent. And also this interesting site, I reckon, I mean, so the Kentish knock, I think reasonably counts as Kent. It's got Kent in the title. You're maybe, again, nearer to Essex or, most of the way to London by the time you're there. You're in the estuary. But here is a very interesting object that is essentially, it's a Maori object. It's a New Zealand sinker that is found under who knows what sort of circumstances in the water off Kent, in this incredibly busy, shipping channel, of course. And so that's that's another object which is something that he acquires. As you'll have seen, most of these objects we've got images, for, because one of the important bits of work that I've done over the years that we all have to do in museums is to do the basic work of sort of documentation. I'm afraid we don't have an image for one of the objects I wanted to mention this evening, which is a hammerstone from near Knockholt Beeches, the famous sort of trees, seven oaks. But he acquires at some point in the 1860s, or certainly before 1874, he acquires some sort of a prehistoric hammerstone. From there are also objects, though, or one object, actually more than anything, that relates to his role as inspector of ancient monuments. And so Kit's Coty house is one of the most important sites in the history of his role as inspector, because it's the first one that he visits after he takes up this new role. Here, from this volume, Our Ancient Monuments, which is a physical bound volume, which we hold now at the Pitt-Rivers. He has a series of sort of photographs, and here on the left-hand side is one of them that shows the graffiti that was on this monument. You can see the three sarsams and the capstone that survive from the Neolithic, what originally was obviously much larger monument of the Neolithic long barrow, chambered long barrow. It looks more like a kind of cairn now, or whatever you call it. But there it was. It was near the railway line and near the road to the seaside, basically, and so found itself sort of being engraved with graffiti. And so Pitt-Rivers acquires it from the Liberal MP Henry Brassey, who I guess was MP for Maidstone or for elsewhere in Kent anyway. Maybe Lubbock was for Maidstone. I don't. He was a local MP anyway. And Augustus Pitt-Rivers erects the fence that you can still see to this day. He erects it to his own design. He obtains £100, which was a lot of money back then, from the Treasury to sort of build the fence. At this time, he also sort of tries to say that there should be policemen at ancient monuments to protect them, but in this case, it is simply the fence. And it's interesting because it sort of turns this monument into a sort of museum exhibit. There's an interpretation board, and there's the fence operates a bit like a vitrine in a museum. And it's a really interesting moment in the history of the development of what we would now call the sort of list that is maintained by Historic England, as the inheriting body for essentially the work that Augustus Pitt-Rivers was doing at that time. So again, ideas of their time in certain ways, but we're dealing with those legacies in a whole host of different ways. Here are some of the drawings of the site from that time. And here is the object we have in the Pitt-Rivers collection, from a series of scale models, miniature models of ancient monuments made by a man called Alfred Lionel Lewis, who was based in Cornwall. Here is Kit's Coty House in Cork. it's rendered in cork. The material is cork, and in some of these cases, I don't know on this one, sometimes there is moss also used to show the vegetation on these sort of wooden bases. And as you can see on the text, it says that Kit's Coty House is 3 miles from Aylesford Station. So this is a way of recording the site, not in a drawing or with an object from the site, but actually making a model of it that is there in the Pitt-Rivers collections today. The second from last object I want to mention is, not an archaeological object, but one of what actually is quite a surprising number of biscuits, which we have in the collections of the Pitt-Rivers Museum, a memorial biscuit, in this case of the Biddenen Maids near Ashford. So this is a biscuit from at some point before, it's more than 150 years old, and it represents the conjoined twins. These were given out, and I think maybe continue to be given out. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from anyone that knows. On Easter Sunday every year, as part of the Easter Day service. But importantly for Pitt-Rivers, he's acquiring this because he sees in the folklore, as he would see it, in the living traditions, he sees survivals of earlier forms of belief, which he sees as outdated as compared with the present. So his whole theory of the supremacism of modern Victorian science is that all around the world you see survivals of old worlds, which are fading away and here you really do, I'm afraid, sort of get into, manifest destiny sorts of arguments, the inevitable fading away of old ways of life, old sort of populations, as he would have put it, as there is an unfolding of a technologically superior culture. So this is not racism in the way that we would see it with the fake racial science, but it's a supremacism and a certain form of sort of cultural supremacism, which has relationships with, cultural whiteness, which is very much there. He's seeing himself as superior to the past. He's seeing his job as an archaeologist and anthropologist as sort of documenting some of that. And here we come to the final object, which in returning to all the documentation work we did 15 years ago, last time we came to talk to your society, something that I, having just written this book, read this object completely differently. So the record on the object, which is it's a socketed iron axe head, recorded later in time as maybe being medieval in date, recorded as from Bigbury Wood near Harbledown on the outskirts of Canterbury, acquired from Cecil Brent, FSA, son of John Brent. For those of you that know the history of antiquarianism in Kent, these might be names that they were both FSAs. They were both, the father was the deputy lieutenant of the county, and both were members of your society. But why is Bigbury Wood important? And I just thought, a wood in Kent. I've read about that. And that was because I was reading and writing about the history of the 45th Regiment of Foot and what E.P. Thompson in his writing on the history of the British working class wrote in the 20th century. So the 45th Regiment of Foot returned from service in India in March 1838, and infamously were involved in the killing of many civilians in the Chartist risings in Newport in South Wales in November 1839. Augustus Pitt-Rivers writes a lot about Chartism. He writes a lot about his role both as a Grenadier Guard. At various points in the book, I talk about the points of insurrection and the Chartist movements and the famous Hyde Park railings affair, in which Augustus Pitt-Rivers was on duty at the point at which you almost, saw a sort of a revolutionary moment. I talk about that a lot in the book, but he acquires at some point in the 1860s this object, which is from Bigbury, which it turns out is actually just up the road from Bossenden Wood, because the year before the Chartist Newport rising, the same regiment, the 45th Regiment, having landed in Kent in March 1838, were involved in the killing of civilians in English. E.P. Thompson called it the last battle fought on English soil, where the Cornishman William Courtenay, fresh from having spent 4 years in the Kent County Lunatic Asylum, developed, there are various interpretations, a cult, a revolutionary movement. It had a lot of, lots of attributes of a sort of cult movement of various kinds. But there were the soldiers, using the same tactics they had been using in India with the company against English civilians. Imperial violence, the imperial boomerang, as some people call it, returning to British soil. That regiment went on to the South African Wars, later in the 1860s, around the time that Pitt-Rivers was acquiring this object, involved in the British expedition to Abyssinia, the famous Magdala expedition. So here is one, it's an object that fits so well to so many objects that he acquired from England, things that relate to that idea that there are survivals of forms of resistance, that the working class themselves were survivals of indigenous resistance that had to be put down, or at the very least, convinced that revolution was a bad idea. So lots of those ideas are explored in the book. I hope that's been an enjoyable excursion, a bit of a field trip, a virtual field trip around the county of Kent, linking it to some of the ideas of Augustus Pitt-Rivers, the complexity of how we think about his legacy in the present. All of this at the Pitt-Rivers, in our archaeological societies, in the discipline of archaeology, is about holding on to the good that we inherit from these thinkers, while being ready to look at the complexity of their ideas and to reject some of those ideas which are really out of time, in the present. That's why the book goes into much more, the questions: how do these things link to, the democratic rights that people have every now and then to rename a building or to remove a memorial? But those are ideas that will have to stay for another time. If you want to hear more about that, obviously you can follow me on Instagram or on the Blue Sky, or also in terms of face-to-face events. I'm doing a whole tour of sort of bookshops and elsewhere in London, but also in the north of England, in Ireland, in Edinburgh. It's all on the website. So hope to see some of you maybe at a face-to-face event as well. But thanks so much for now. Thanks for listening.
Dan, thank you so much. That was a fantastic story, and wow, I had no idea there were so many connections between Pitt-Rivers and Kent. Honestly, it's I'll just say quickly, if you have any questions, please do add them to the chat for them. Yeah, Pitt-Rivers is such a familiar name in archaeology. I've heard it throughout my academic time and throughout, everything. It's always there, but I honestly had no idea that it's quite so much connection to Kent, even despite being here. And I've stood at that fence at Coty. I've even filmed a Halloween special from there, and I had no idea that was the work of Pitt-Rivers as well. So what a incredible story. I mean, I love seeing the evolution of the context sheet and the site drawings, which is really interesting, and it emerged from those military essentials. There's that connection between the military and systemized excavation. Does that still is there a trace of that still today, or?
I think there is. I feel, part of the way that we inherit these ideas and these attitudes is almost in our bodies. I felt when I was being trained how to dig, it was only 4 generations or so between people that have been, taught by Pitt-Rivers himself. And there is something about that. I'm so interested in how these sort of chains of transmission work, because some people say, you've got to decolonize the reading list, you've got to update what we teach. Absolutely right. But the problem is nobody teaches or reads Pitt-Rivers anymore. Like you say, he's a name you hear. Nobody's actually sat, very rarely would it be that people sit down and read him, but his ideas are with us in the present. And I feel they're not so much in the actual words, they're in the attitudes, the framings, things we take for granted, and we need to be even in our bodies. you know,
Mm.
in the field, in the way that we think about excavation trenches and so on. So it's really complex, but I think part of how we think about these legacies of the past has to
Still
be
there.
about the tacit and the implicit, as well as just the obvious things that they said on paper. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I, I did notice that there's sort of there's imperial visions, because seen a lot of those kind of Tudor images of how prehistory looked, and it's always based upon what was happening in the Americas at the time. So there's always seems to be that kind of tying in what you can see at the moment, with the as the empire is spreading with what you believe happened here all those years ago, which is a
Yeah.
strange. uh, but yeah, and also thank you very much for the Frederick James, our museum curator. I shall certainly have to check that out and find out more about him, learn more. Um, in fact, I'm interested because you mentioned a couple of people there who were part of CAS, the Kent Archaeological Society. Do you know, like in your studies, do you know how much connections he had with the society? Did he have any? Because obviously we were founded in 1857, so the timing is good, but was he
Yeah,
involved?
absolutely. I don't know. I think so. I mean, when we did this, a lovely project with the local archaeology societies for excavating Pitt Rivers, some of the societies, and that included Yorkshire and Sussex, he'd actually been their president. Yeah,
Okay,
Pitt Rivers was the president because he was a very, as I talk about in the book, he loved to sit, he loved a committee, he loved to sit on committees. He's a serial, bureaucrat in the discipline. I don't know. I don't think he was ever president of
okay.
Kent.
So he
And
was
in some
involved
ways,
with.
his interactions with Kent are kind of earlier. He doesn't really go back. Certainly after he gets the money and becomes Pitt Rivers, he isn't. He isn't over there as much. But of course, it's interesting. There's also there's the Darwin link to some degree to what then was West Kent, uh, and where Darwin was. So I think to some degree it's the sort of Bromley end of outskirts of London as
Sure.
being the Kent link early on,
Yeah.
and then there's the military coastal stuff. Chatham down to Hythe, and then he comes back because he's doing the South Coast things in sort of Sussex, and then less so later on. But yeah, in terms of other interactions, not sure. Not sure as much. But yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, we could easily look at I mean, lots of this is about the collectors and the antiquarians involved.
I'm gonna have to go
Names. You
go
just find the
through.
names, you look up where they are in the collections, Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go through our. We've got plenty of the registry books of the meetings and stuff, so I'll have to see if he turned up to any of them.
Yeah,
If it was
absolutely. And so
any
I've just
time.
seen the comment from Nicholas, who I think's here still. So many thanks for confirming on Biddenden. I thought they would continue to. I mean, it's been many years since I thought about those biscuits. Although they are on display if you want to come and see them. Obviously, it might be a bit easier just to go down and see some less
Different ones,
ancient ones
maybe in Bidden.
in Biddenden itself. Yeah.
I'm actually asking about the displays. So, do you display the Kent material together over at the Pitt Rivers, or is it kind of
No,
spread throughout, or is
no,
it even on
obviously it's a
display?
typological museum, and lots of what I showed you isn't on display. But yeah, you can do a little hunt around what's there. If you look on the website, it will say whether it's on display or not. And our front of house colleagues are very good at helping you identify things. But no, I'm afraid there isn't a Kent.
Okay,
There isn't a
not a
Kent
Kent section that
case.
we can
The
get a
whole
photo
point of
of.
what he did, he mixed up contexts in order to tell his story of
Mhm.
series. So it's much more
Sure.
like, the Samian ware almost certainly is in a case of here are bowls. How do people make bowls in different societies? And it's just one
Okay.
of one of many.
Gotcha.
That's the thinking that he had. Yeah.
And some of those recreations were interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of imagination going on there, perhaps, in certain ones. But I suppose if you're learning by what's coming out of the ground, you have to make those leaps now and again.
Yeah.
So Nicholas said, some might say earlier Kent archaeologists like Brian Fawcett, James Douglas, and Charles Roach Smith were more pioneering, but less scientific and more antiquarian, of course. What do you
Yeah,
think
yeah.
of that?
It depends what we mean by pioneering, and whether we want to tell histories about people being pioneering, or to tell other kinds of histories. I mean, I think yeah, I think I know Roach Smith. I don't know those other names offhand, but I mean, Pitt Rivers himself said we shouldn't be writing big man history. Actually, he very much argued against, great man history and other kinds of history. I talk about in the book quite what that means for him, and what he meant by that. But there are other ways. I mean, I'm sure, as we've learned about for so many other parts of Britain, there are very important women archaeologists in the history of our discipline, and it's in the regions often that we tell them. But I think understanding these histories, I'm sort of telling the story as I can see it from Oxford. But a part of the reason that I think in some ways his sort of his early Kent collecting is no different to what loads of antiquarians were doing at that time. What makes it exceptional is what he does later. The thing he does at Caesar's camp,
Mhm.
and the relationship of I guess what he's doing at Hythe,
Yeah,
other different things. Yeah, yeah.
it
But I'd
was.
love to learn more. I mean, I think one thing that can be done really well in sort of local archaeology societies is understanding who these characters are and what they did and where they worked. Yeah.
I think we
Making
have.
sure it's on the HER as well. That's the other thing. I mean, actually
Okay.
making sure some of
Yeah.
the basic stuff that the antiquarians found out. So one thing we did early on was we sent all this information off to the HER and made sure and some of the sites were not there.
No, no. There's a lot of unpublished and even unrecognized older work. I think we probably in our collections we're trying to get through at the moment. We found that there are a lot of those, in the back of notebooks, sites that were
Yeah,
dug and in all kinds of conditions that have
yeah,
never seen the light of day. So hopefully we can keep bringing them out and exposing them
yeah.
and showing what was understood and happening at the time. I don't know if you've been. So I noticed the Dean holes was an interesting
Hmm.
conversation as well. So I don't know if you've been in any of the Dean holes. Have you before?
No,
I
no, I
say
haven't.
because I've
No.
I've just last week I got to explore one of my first Dean hole experience of Kent, which was a
Okay.
pretty amazing. I love the fact that they're still such an enigma. There's still all these questions about the age and their use. And I think a lot of people are settled on the fact it's a kind of chalk mine for the acidic soils and the like, but there is still that tantalizing possibility that these things are earlier. And it's not mutually exclusive. I imagine, you could be a
Yeah.
chalk mine which has ritual significance and there's depositions and the rest, but they
That's
are
right.
very
So Pitt
interesting.
Rivers is definitely on exactly that conversation 150 years ago. And what's I think always humbling is you go back to some of these early archaeologies and you realize exactly the conversation that we're having now was already being had. No
Sure.
one hasn't had an answer then either. Fantastic. I see we're losing people a bit, and I also it's been a long day
Yeah,
for
you
me,
probably need
so
to get.
we
No,
we
thank
might
you, Dan.
draw things to a conclusion here.
Yeah. No, no, no. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
That's great.
Yeah, so thank you for coming and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for that amazing view into the world of Pitt Rivers and the environment he was working within. It's great to see his connections with Kent, and it's something that I'm very keen to explore more. So I'll be looking through all of my documents this week to try and see how I can see if I can find any more mentions of him.
Absolutely
So
fantastic.
so
Yeah.
we've got lots more coming up. So please do keep an eye out for our upcoming talks. On October 30th, we've got our very own Jacob Scott talking to us about medieval and historic graffiti at Rochester Cathedral, revealing 900 years of history told through the inscriptions, scratches, and marks on the walls and piers of Rochester Cathedral and the ruins of the Cathedral Priory of St Andrew. He's going to be dressed as either a zombie or a princess. I haven't decided which yet. Perhaps both, maybe. We'll see. It's our Halloween special. On Thursday, the 20th of November, experimental archaeologist Alexander Reed will take a look at an early Anglo-Saxon sword from the cemetery at Sarr and use experimental to explain how it was made and show the technologies available. to the Saxon blacksmiths. In December, we delve into Kentish medieval merriments with a talk from the amazing Dr. Christopher Monk. And in January, Jason Hulock will be talking to us about medieval knife crime. So we have plenty of talks. We've got talks all the way through February and March as well. We're booking well into the year ahead. So our fantastic histories continue. Please feel free to join us. And if you'd like to give us a talk for the Society, do get in touch. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not a member, think about joining us. Only £3.30 a month and you get loads of amazing stuff and we would love to have you. Check the website for more details on the talks and a wide range of other upcoming Kent-based events, as well as how to become a member. Thank you so much, Dan. Really appreciate you talking to us today. And we hope you won't be a stranger and you'll come and visit us in Kent. So
Yeah.
thank you
I
all
look
for
forward to
being
it.
here. Brilliant. All right. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks. See ya.